I'm delighted to be back with everybody for the last session for discussing one of the topics that's been on my mind for some time. How great is Bhakti? Exploring the reach of a powerful force. And going to be a lot of slides today, and I'm a little concerned about time, but I think it'll be all right because the first bunch of slides will be a review. I've edited them down, and we can probably get through them pretty quickly because I just want to make sure that we're all. I'm not sure if there's anyone here who hasn't been with us for the previous weeks, but I just want to make sure everybody kind of is able to follow the train of my thought as I went through my little kind of intellectual / emotional saga with regard to this topic. And I've called this part some resolution. And we'll discuss what I mean by some at the end. So where it all started was with Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's Tika or commentary to the 19th verse of the 5th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam's first canto. Navai Janujatu Katanchana Brajain Mukunda Sevyan Vayadangra Samshritin Smaran Mukundang Ryupapuhanam Punar Vihatu Nichen Navasagara Hojana. My dear Vyas, even though a devotee of Lord Krishna sometimes falls down somehow or other, he certainly does not undergo material existence like others, fruitive workers, etc. Because a person who has once relished the taste of the lotus feet of the Lord can do nothing but remember that ecstasy again and again. And in his Tika, this is the entire commentary on that verse, Vishwanath writes, the verse also uses the phrase does not desire to give up instead of does not give up. This implies that the bhakta, be devoid of pride in his practice. The accomplishment is in the hands of the Lord. We know this. This is a kind of a basic thing. This is what we learn from the Bhagavad Gita. We have a right to do our duty. We don't have a right to be attached to the results. So the same with our sadhana. We have a right to practice, but and we have a right to practice enthusiastically, utsahat, but we should also be patient and perseverant. Utsaha nishchaya dhairyat. So, and that's actually our success. Our success is our dedication to our practice. And the accomplishment is, as Vishwanath says here, in the Lord's hands. And then he says, and this is where it gets tasty for me, the cause of not desiring is then mentioned. Rasagraha means one who is eager for tasting, or who has a taste, which is something like a ghost, which cannot be given up, haunted by rasa. And then my assumption has always been that this next sentence is kind of presented as a samshaya or a doubt. He's raising a doubt so that he can address that. He's anticipating a doubt in his audience. The meaning is then that worship after the stages of nishta, ruchi, and asakti becomes actual rasa at the stage of rati. However, he says, from the first day of worshiping the Lord, there is certainly a portion of tasting rasa in a very covered form. Thus it is said, Bhakti pareshana bhavo viraktiran yatra chaishatrika eka kalaha prapadyamanasya yatashnatashyus tushti pushtikshurapaya nubhasa. Devotion, direct experience of the Supreme Lord, and detachment from other things, these three occur simultaneously for one who has taken shelter. And in light of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's Tika on this verse, which I'll see in a moment, I would also, I generally add simultaneously and progressively for one who has taken shelter because of the nature of the analogy that he makes. In the same way that pleasure, fullness of the stomach, and relief from hunger are experienced simultaneously with each bite, for a person engaged in eating. And on this, on this verse, he comments, an example is given to show that even at the stage of sadhana, which gives great happiness, one achieves the result. When there is bhakti in the form of hearing and chanting about Krishna, the supreme deity, there should be a sweet experience. At that time, there should also be an experience of detachment from material happiness. These three should arise at the same time for the person who worships Krishna. Similarly, for a person who eats, there is happiness, nourishment, and disappearance of hunger with each mouthful. So this is a progressive thing. As one takes a mouthful of rice, this happens. Just as a person who eats a little gets a little satisfaction, a little nourishment or fullness of the stomach, and a little relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord a little with hearing and chanting gets a little experience of the Lord and a little detachment from material life. And just as a person who eats a lot gets full satisfaction, full nourishment, and full relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord fully experiences the Lord fully and becomes completely detached from material life. But, and here he's pointing out the flaw in the analogy, as there always is, though it is impossible to keep eating, by more worship of the Lord, one becomes more capable of worshiping. This is the difference. So after a while, after a certain amount of eating, we become detached even from eating. But by practicing bhakti, we don't become detached from practicing bhakti, and instead we become progressively attached to our practice. And then I came across these verses from the Uddhava Gita, and we're going to come back to these later, as I've mentioned before. Krishna says, my dear Uddhava, if my devotee has not fully conquered his senses, he may be harassed by material desires. But because of his unflinching devotion for me, he will not be defeated by sense gratification. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, putting aside the topic of the devotee who has developed bhava. So in other words, he's saying, okay, let's not talk about a sadhya bhakta, a siddha bhakta, because bhava is the sadhya of sadhana. It's the attainment. It's what we're working for when we engage in sadhana. That's our accomplishment. So setting aside that, the devotee at the beginning of bhakti is also successful. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, okay, here we go. By bhakti, which is generally strong, but to speak of bhakti, which is very strong, the devotee cannot be overcome by material enjoyment. And then he brings up the well-known verse toward the end of the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He says, but the devotee who commits sin is not criticized, and his position as a devotee is not denied. And I didn't include this here, but he's contrasting that with the jnani. Because if the jnani commits some sin, if there's some flaw in the jnani's practice, then their position as a jnani is denied. There is no accomplishment, and they can be criticized. So then Vishwanath cites this verse, api chet sudracharo bhujate mam ananyapak sadhureva samantavya samyak vyavasito. Even if the most sinful person worships me with no other desire than to please me, that's the ananyapak. In other words, he doesn't have any other goal that he wants to accomplish. He simply wants to satisfy Krishna, not propitiate the demigods for some material advancement or engage in jnana in order to attain liberation. But if his only goal is to satisfy Krishna, even if he doesn't do it perfectly, and we saw that back in the verse I started with, the 19th verse of the 5th chapter in the 1st canto, that even if the devotee falls away somehow or other, by bad association, poor determination, whatever, still success is guaranteed for the devotee, whereas it's not for anyone engaged in other paths. If that person worships me with no desire other than to please me, I consider that person to be my devotee, as he has fixed himself completely in me. And we see in the next verse that, I think in Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says the next day, but I think you see that here. Yeah, the next day, everything is going to be okay. Though the devotee is distressed by sense objects, he's not overcome. Because both verbs are in the present tense, it implies that even while being harassed by sense objects, he's not really harassed, since bhakti is present. A person who is attacked by the weapons of an enemy cannot be defeated because of the presence of his bravery. Or, on the day that a powerful medicine is taken to prevent fever, though the fever still causes suffering, it's not a real cause of suffering, since the fever is in a state of being destroyed and will be completely destroyed the next day. And then we see the same theme in the next verse, and we're going to come back to this, as I've mentioned before, come back to this in a few minutes. My dear Uddhava, just as a blazing fire turns firewood into ashes, similarly, devotion to me completely burns to ashes sins committed by my devotees. And Srila Vishwanath, from his Tika, I didn't include the whole Tika for this slide because it's just a review and we have a lot more slides to get through. Bhakti destroys the sins committed by the devotee who cannot control his senses. An example is given. Addressing Uddhava, he implies that Uddhava should be joyful, because Uddhava means joyful on hearing this. So Bhakti destroys even the sins that the devotee commits if they can't control her senses. So as we'll see, it's really clear here that we're not talking about Siddha Bhakti. We're talking about Sadhana Bhakti. We're not talking about Sadhya Bhakti. We're not talking about someone who's attained Bhava or Prema. We're talking about someone who may still be struggling with their senses, may still be struggling with their mind, but they continue. And then this is later in the same chapter. When a diseased eye is treated with a medicinal ointment, it gradually recovers its power to see. Similarly, as a conscious living entity cleanses himself of material contamination by hearing and chanting the pious narrations of my glories, he regains his ability to see me, the absolute truth, in my subtle spiritual form. And Vishwanath writes, starting with the first service. So we saw that back in his Tika to that first canto purport. From the first day of practice, from the first day of worshiping the Lord, this happens. Starting with the first service, in proportion to the purification of the Atma by pure bhakti, and in proportion to the hearing, chanting, and remembering, one attains various degrees of realization of my sweetness. In proportion to hearing and chanting my glories, one sees the real nature of my form and pastimes with an experience of sweetness. So this is also clearly addressing, at least from Sri Vishwanath's perspective, sadhana bhakti, not sadhya bhakti. But then I wondered, it seems like Vishwanath is really, based on this and other things that we read, it seems like he's maybe a little zealous in his glorification of bhakti. He's really all about the power of bhakti, as we see in many places. We see this particularly in his Madhurya Kadambini, where he begins with a kind of a little extended argument about how independent Krishna is. And he does that in order to make the point that bhakti is every bit as independent as Krishna is, and to show us just how she works. So then I thought, okay, Jiva Goswami is sometimes a little more conservative about some things. So let me see, what he says when we talk about Bhakti having the power to control Krishna in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. I thought I would see if Rupa Goswami said anything, and then see what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, what Srila Jiva Goswami said in his commentary, because it had been a while, I think, since I had read it when I started thinking about this. So he talks in the first chapter, when he's just, in the first chapter where he's discussing Bhakti in a general sense, Samanya Bhakti, he calls the chapter. He discusses 6 characteristics that we see manifested in those who are practicing sadhana bhakti, who are practicing bhakti. So 2, kleshagni and shupada, relief from material distress and bestowal of auspiciousness. These become particularly prominent in the stage of sadhana bhakti. And then sudurlabha and moksha lagutakrit. It's extreme rarity, and it's penchant for making even liberation seem insignificant, lightweight, laghutakrit, making it seem lightweight, especially by comparison with bhakti. Those become prominent during Bhava Bhakti, and then in Prema Bhakti, we see, oh gosh, it's me in lists again. Oh, Sandrananda Visheshatma and Sri Krishna Karshani. So Sandrananda Visheshatma means it's a very concentrated form of bliss. When you take bliss and you boil it down, it's like taking a gallon of milk and making some pera with it. You cook it down and cook it down and cook it down until it's until it's caramel, until you've got basically a sugar daddy. I don't know if that reference works for people who've never had sugar daddies because they're not American or a lot younger than that. Anyway, it's a very chewy milk sweet pera. So Bhakti attracts Krishna and his associates, and Rupa Goswami says Bhakti is called Sri Krishna Karshani because it makes the Lord addicted to prema and brings him under control along with his associates. And then in the next verse, Rupa Goswami cites one of these verses from the 14th chapter of the 11th canto from the Uddhava Gita. That says, Na sadhayate mam yogo, na sankyam dharma uddhava, na svadhyayas tapastyago yatha bhaktir mamorjita. The Bhagavatam says, my dear Uddhava, the unalloyed devotional service in the form of prema bhakti rendered to me by my devotees brings me under the control. And I thought, oh, in the form of prema bhakti. Interesting. So then I started to really wonder. And then he makes a comparison with other practices, yoga, Sankhya philosophy, punya, svadhyaya, tapa, and tyaga. He says these things can't control him the same way that bhakti can. And here again, he's referring to prema bhakti, and Jiva Goswami comments, and then this is where I began to become a little deflated, to be honest. Though one may conclude that the bhakti mentioned here is sadhana by comparing it with other processes such as Sankhya, it cannot be an example of sadhana that brings Krishna under control because of the statement in verse 41 that Krishna is brought under control only by sadhya bhakti. So that's just the previous verse. Thus, the meaning is bhakti after producing sadhya bhakti, prema controls me. So I'm starting to wonder again about the zeal with which Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur presents bhakti's unique power. even sadhana bhakti's unique power. So then I thought, okay, so where else would we see this? Where else would we see, especially Jiva Goswami, discuss this? And of course, that would be the Bhakti Sandarbha. Out of the 6 Sandarbhas, the first 4 explore Sambandha Tattva, the relationship of the Jiva with the Lord. And then the 5th one, the Bhakti Sandarbha, discusses Abhideya Tattva, and that is bhakti as a practice. And then bhakti or prema, especially prema bhakti, is discussed in the Priti Sandarbha, the 6th of the 6 Sandarbhas. So I thought, okay, would I be able to find this discussed in the Bhakti Sandarbha? And I did find it in Anucheta 147, section 147, which in the edition that I was looking at first, the subtitle is, Even Sadhana Bhakti Captivates the Lord. And I just thought, here's Jiva Goswami asserting that even Sadhana Bhakti captivates the Lord. And what I found was a rather extended argument exploring a section of verses in that 14th chapter of the 11th canto. And so I saw, this is where we ended up last time. And I found myself a little intrigued. I ended with a kind of a cliffhanger / teaser last time. So Jiva Goswami writes, Dhruva's life is the proof that bhakti bestows results far exceeding anything a devotee could conceive within the mind, because the Lord offered Dhruva his own planet, along with supreme devotion. Examples of how bhakti controls the Lord have already been given in verses such as this. And this is the verse we just saw as the Pramana verse for Sri Krishna Karshini in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. My dear Uddhava, the unalloyed devotion. Now here we see unalloyed devotional service. Rather than prema bhakti, we're talking about Shuddha bhakti or Uttama bhakti. And that's what we're engaged in, even in sadhana bhakti. Because we see in the 11th verse of the first chapter, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu's first chapter, what we're going to be talking about is Uttama bhakti. And we see it defined in that verse and in the 12th verse, which is a Pramana verse, as engaging our senses in the service of the Lord's senses with an intention of giving him pleasure. So this is interesting. Unalloyed devotional service rendered to me by my devotees brings me under control. I cannot thus be controlled by those engaged in mystic yoga, Sankhya philosophy, pious work, Vedic study, austerity, or renunciation. After this verse, next verse, the Lord also said, Bhaktyaha mekaya grahya shuddhayatma priyasatam. Bhakti punatimam nishta swapakan api sambhava. It's like a typo there. Only by practicing unalloyed devotional service with full faith can one obtain me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. I am naturally dear to my devotees who take me as the only goal of their loving service. By engaging in such pure devotional service, even the dog eaters can purify themselves from the contamination of their low birth. And Jiva Goswami points out, a point to be considered here is that this statement, which appears in the 14th chapter of the 11th canto, is a description of the glories of bhakti without specifying whether the bhakti being referred to is that of the practicing stage or the perfectionist stage. Therefore, it is difficult to establish from this verse that it is the greatness of bhakti in the practicing stage that is referred to. Yet, and this is a big one, and he mentions this again later. Even if the verse is describing the glories of bhakti in the perfectionist stage, the practice stage is thereby glorified because it is only through practice that perfection comes about. So then I'm thinking, oh, wow, okay, let's keep going. And so then Jiva Goswami says, he continues by saying that the chapter begins with a question by Uddhava, which initiates a discussion about sadhana bhakti. So we're talking, we may be talking specifically about sadhana bhakti. And he's pointing that out. This is actually, the context is, this is this discussion of sadhana bhakti. Vadanti Krishna Shreyansi Bahuni Brahmavadina Tesham Vikalpa Pradyanam Utaho Ekamukyata. My dear Krishna, Uddhava said, the learned sages who explain Vedic literature recommend various processes for perfecting one's life. Considering these varieties of viewpoint, my Lord, please tell me whether all these processes are equally important or one of them is supreme. The discussion concludes, and this is, we saw this verse earlier with verse 26, with the following statement of the Lord, which also refers specifically to sadhana bhakti. Yata yatatma parimurjate sao matpunya gata shravanadhi bhidanaha. Tata tata pashyati vastu shukshman chakshur yatayavas. Oh, it's supposed to be yatayavag. I sometimes have a problem converting some of the diacritics. So when a diseased eye is treated with medicinal ointment, it gradually recovers its power to see. Similarly, as a conscious living entity cleanses himself of material contamination by hearing and chanting the pious narrations of my glories, he regains his ability to see me, the absolute truth, in my subtle spiritual form. In particular, Jiva continues, there is a subdivision of this section, verses 18 through 22, that deals primarily with the glories of sadhana bhakti. The first person the subdivision states, and we saw this one before, Badhyamanopi madbhakto vishaya rajitindriya praya pragalbhaya bhaktya vishaya napi bhuyate. If my devotee has not fully conquered his senses, he may be harassed by material desires because of his unflinching devotion to me. He will not be defeated by sense gratification. And then he says, and the subdivision ends with this statement. Dharma satya dayo petyo vidya va tapasandata madbhaktya petamatmana nasamyak prapunati. Neither religious activities endowed with honesty and mercy, nor knowledge obtained with great penance can completely purify one's consciousness if they're bereft of loving service to me. In the midst of this subsection, the reference to a devotee's being impeded by attraction for sense objects found in verse 18 is clearly a reference to the stage of practice. So this is Jiva Goswami. And so, I began to wonder about this compared with the strength of his statement, using verses from this same section of chapter 14. In his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu Tika. So says this is clearly a reference to the stage of practice, because once sadhya bhakti is manifested, there's no possibility of any obstacles. This is stated by the Shrutis personified in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is from the 87th chapter, Prayers of the Personified Vedas. Sages free from false pride live on this earth by frequenting the sacred pilgrimage sites and those places where the Supreme Lord displayed his pastimes. Because such devotees keep your lotus feet within their hearts, the water that washes their feet destroys all sins. Anyone who even once turns his mind toward you, the ever blissful soul of all existence, no longer dedicates himself to serving family life at home, which simply robs a man of his good qualities. And then Jiva Goswami continues, the following statement from the Vishnu Purana is also a reference to the glories of sadhana bhakti. Those whose hearts are immersed in sense enjoyment cannot fix their minds on Lord Vishnu. Can a person find an object lying in the west by searching for it in the east? After the subsection referred to, the Lord made this statement, which relates to sadhya bhakti. So this is the verse right after the little subsection. So he says this refers to sadhya bhakti because of reference to ecstatic symptoms. If one's hairs do not stand on end, how can the heart melt? And if the heart does not melt, how can tears of love flow from the eyes? And if one does not cry in spiritual happiness, how can one render loving service to the Lord? And without such service, how can the consciousness be purified? So Jiva Goswami points out that this is about sadhya bhakti. In the next verse, also sadhya bhakti. A devotee whose speech is sometimes choked up, whose heart melts, who cries continually, and sometimes laughs, and who feels ashamed and cries out loudly and then dances. Again, we're seeing ecstatic symptoms. The devotee thus fixed in loving service to me purifies the entire universe. So Jiva Goswami writes, the implication of this statement is that if sadhya bhakti purifies the whole world, what to speak of purifying the desires for enjoyment that remain in the heart of the practicing devotee? Thus, by Kaimukya Nyaya, I don't remember exactly what Kaimukya Nyaya is, but it kind of, I think it's like extending or by implication. The power of sadhya bhakti to remove the subtle inclinations for enjoyment is established. The subtle desires for enjoyment are again a reference to Srimad Bhagavatam 11, 14, 18, which describes the condition of devotees still impeded by such desires. After the attainment of sadhya bhakti, the sense objects themselves become curtailed and can no longer overpower the devotee. So then he says, so after discussing verse 18 again, then he moves on to 19. He says that this 19 is also all about sadhana bhakti because we're talking about namapas and its power of uprooting sins. So just as a blazing fire burns a pile of firewood to ashes, devotion directed toward me, O Uddhava, destroys all sins. And then he says, after this, the next 1.5 verses also describe sadhana bhakti. First, in verse 20, by Krishna stating that he can be captivated only by devotion and not by yoga. We just looked at that a couple of minutes ago. Not by yoga, sankhya, and other methods. Bhakti is contrasted with other methods of sadhana. Oops, gosh. Oh dear. Since different methods of practice can be contrasted only with something else, that is also a practice. Something else that is also a practice. The bhakti being referred to here can only be sadhana, not sadhya. And then he says, in addition, in the first half of 11, 14, 21, Krishna states that he can be obtained only by devotion endowed with faith. The understanding is that sadhya bhakti is attained only by performing sadhana bhakti with faith. Therefore, if this verse were referring to sadhya bhakti, the mention of faith would be redundant. Hence, this half verse also can only refer to sadhana bhakti. I think, and then he continues. Although the Lord is controlled only by sadhya bhakti, we have shown that this entire section deals primarily with sadhana bhakti. Therefore, the characteristic of bhakti to control the Lord is spoken of here in reference to sadhana bhakti. Moreover, a significant principle is stated in this verse. Astveva manga bhagavan vachitam mukundo muktim dadati karhachit smana bhakti yoga. O king, sometimes the Lord This is a verse from the 5th canto. Sometimes the Lord Krishna easily awards liberation to those who serve him, but not bhakti yoga, the opportunity for direct loving service to him. And Jiva says, the implication of this statement is that the Lord does not award prema, the perfectional stage of bhakti, unless he is first brought under the control of the devotee who worships him. In other words, the Lord must be brought under control by sadhana bhakti before he will award prema bhakti. Therefore, the power to control the Lord is directly spoken of here as a characteristic of sadhana bhakti. So this is Jiva Goswami's argument for how do I stop sharing? Oh, okay. I guess somehow or other I stumbled across it. So this is Jiva Goswami's argument that when we talk about having the power to control Krishna, that we're also talking about sadhana bhakti. So this seems to confirm Vishwanath Chakravarti's assertion in his commentaries on the Bhagavatam in the 1st canto and in the 11th canto, as we saw. So then the thing that came to mind, as I mentioned last time, I alluded to this, is the chronology of these works. And so I was conjecturing that his Bhagavatam commentaries may have been written after his commentaries on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. As we know, as most of us probably know, Jiva Goswami served Rupa Goswami as his editor for Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So we'll see some of his comments in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu saying something like, well, the author meant to say here, or the author here intended to imply, or something like that. And he knows that because he worked, I assume at least sometimes, knee to knee with Rupa Goswami, had access to him, was able to ask him questions about things. Now, I think it was, excuse me, I think it was Shamananda who did a little digging. I haven't done this yet. What do they say on the internet? Do your own research. And I hadn't done this yet. But Shamananda did a little digging, and he found that the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu Tika was apparently written after the Bhagavatam commentaries. So I wasn't too happy to hear that, because it was the opposite, I think, of what something in the back of my mind I was at least hoping to find. But here, still, in the Bhakti Sandarbha, which is a definitive work, a foundational work, as our friend Dulal Chandra likes to say, from one of the foundational acharyas, and someone whom we consider perhaps the greatest philosopher who's ever lived, greatest theologian who's ever lived, Srila Jiva Goswami, who was taught by the other Goswamis. He was personally instructed by Rupa and Sanatana especially, and who worked with them, as we mentioned, with Rupa Goswami in editing the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Still, he didn't go back and edit it. He didn't change it. So there's this very strong rather extended argument, exploring these verses, showing how out of, I think, 7 verses, 6.5 of the verses actually address sadhana bhakti as having some power, at least some power, to control Krishna. Even if it's to bring Krishna under control enough to be able to give the devotee sadhya bhakti, bhava bhakti, and then prema bhakti. So even sadhana bhakti must have some power to control Krishna in order for Krishna to award the devotee the accomplished stages of bhakti. So this is where I am, and I have to work it out. I think how to deal with that is something that I may end up discussing with Guru Maharaj and maybe Prabhupada, and perhaps also Radhika Raman, ISKCON's Radhika Raman, who has a PhD from the University of Oxford in in Jiva Goswami's theology, and try to see how I can understand how I can resolve what appears to be an inconsistency in his assertions. But it looks like we have a pretty strong argument for even sadhana bhakti, for being able to bring Krishna under her control. We see in the Shruti, in the Vedas, in a Vedic text called a verse from something called Matara Shruti, and it's a Vedic text, so it's ancient and fundamental. That bhakti alone has the power to show us Krishna. Bhakti alone has the power to draw us near to Krishna. Bhakti alone has the power to subdue Krishna. Therefore, bhakti is the greatest of all things. So, I mean, if we see that even there, that bhakti alone has the power to not only show us Krishna and draw us near to him, but to bring him under control. And Jiva Goswami makes it sound as though the Lord is being brought under the devotee's control, but really he's brought under the control of whatever bhakti that devotee may carry in his or her heart. So that's where I am, and this is kind of how I got there. And this is one of the projects that that I need to complete. Unfortunately, I'm still young, and I have plenty of time. Well, actually, that's not the case. So I have to apparently start taking better care of myself and get to work because I have a few writing projects that that I must complete. This is one of them. I have a couple of articles and then a little book about Sharanagati. I hope it's a little book about Sharanagati that I intend to put together someday. So anyway, that's the deal with me and the power of bhakti. And it's 1:15, so it's a good time to stop and entertain any questions, comments, reflections, or any kind of discussion. And it's nice to see the wry smile of my friend Bangshi here on the screen. Okay, so I don't have the power to unmute anybody then. So I think that's up to Shamananda or Sakyarati. Okay, we can hear you. Vandavats Bangshi, my old friend.
Anyone can unmute if they want to. There is no.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Yeah, they just have to make sure they're in the English channel.
Okay, so I assume that means that you're as encouraged and perhaps even a little as confused as I am. And I mean, I have to write this to figure it out. This is what I taught in college for 20-some, and universities for a number of years. Okay, oh, Sarda has a question.
Well, Maharaj, I just would like to know if there's any other literature, especially looking at this verse, Srimad Bhagavatam 11:14-24, the symptoms of the devotee. Is there, could you tell me about any other symptoms in any other verses, of any other literature, because I'd like to know about that. Just looking on my own experiences, it's not that I would like to look at the stage which I'm out necessarily. I'm not really obsessed with that, but I would like to know. It would be very nice to see some other references, or any other verses which are similar to this verse about Sadhya Bhakti. Is it only in
well,
the
there are.
Srimad Bhagavatam? Yeah.
Well, there are, and we see those in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu.
Okay.
In the section of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, discussing all the, it's discussing Prema Bhakti, all the different kinds of ratis, the 5 different ratis that combine together to create rasa. So we see, we see an almost bewildering an ocean. Actually, when I was discussing with this with an online group whom I read this with 3 nights a week, we're reading the Nectar of Devotion and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu together. And in this section, all the different anubhavas and vyabhichari or sanchari bhavas, and how they all combine together, which combine with others and which don't really combine with others. It's so nuanced that I felt that, okay, so here we are taking a little dip in the ocean of nectar of devotion, but we seem at the moment to be swimming through a section quite choked with very thick seaweed. And it's it can be a little rough going almost, and quite bewildering. And when I stop every 15 or 20 minutes to ask for comments or questions, it's like crickets, because everybody's just like, it's just gone. You know, we're just, oh my God, I can't even, how do I sort all these things out? Because it becomes so nuanced and complex. So it's described there in the 3rd section, in those chapters in the 3rd section of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So, and it's quite wonderful. And, you know, as far as sadhana bhakti, I do have some more things put together, although I haven't really assimilated them yet to the extent that I was willing to share them yet. However, as I come across more material as I work on this, I'm probably going to be sharing tidbits with my, with my friends here and there, wherever I have friends, I guess on Facebook or wherever. I'm not much of a social media person, but I will be sharing these things. And my next series is certainly on Sadhya Bhakti, because I've been asked to discuss the Rasa Leela next month. So that's a little daunting. I'm going to be a little immersed in that, which is quite wonderful. I thought, my initial thought was, no, I saw myself as one of Edvard Munch's Scream pictures, oh no. But then I thought, no, this is what Kartik's about. Throw yourself into this. And if you drown, what's the loss? Who's going to, what would I have lost? And nobody's going to miss me anyway. So, it'll be wonderful, even if I drown. This is Tripurari Maharaj, Srila Tripurari Maharaj, Guru Maharaj writes this in his introduction to his Shikshastakam. He said, if I were to drown in the process of exploring this, what would be the loss? So I always like that.
We would meet you, Maharaj.
So yeah, there will be more to come. This is kind of where I am at this point, and I decided to share this, to share my process with others in order to create a positive impetus. The negative impetus is the clock on the wall, because I am 74 and not having as much fun with my body as I did when I was 25. But the positive impetus is that I think this is a really cool thing, and I want to figure it out to the extent that I'm able and share my process with others. So when I was teaching writing, college and university writing, one of my approaches was writing as an epistemic activity, as a way of figuring things out. And so that by doing that, I tried to encourage my students not to just write little essays that were tracts explaining what they thought is true, but exploring things that they might not understand, completely have figured out yet, and stick their necks out a little bit. So here I am with my neck stuck out. I'm made myself a little vulnerable, I think, by sharing this prematurely with others. I also have to marvel at Haripriya's smile on her profile picture. Haripriya has one of the world's, I think, one of the world's great smiles. Anything else? Thank you so much, though, for that question.
Thank you. Very inspiring.
There will be more.
Thank
There
you.
will be more.
Good. Thank you. I look forward to that. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else?
It's good to see you, Maharaj. I'm so happy that you're doing
Okay, then with
notes.
your permission, we can adjourn here. And
Vamsi,
oh,
Hey,
Maharaj can't hear you. Maybe are you in the English channel?
oh, no, I was in the off channel.
Okay.
I just want to say nice to see you.
wait,
and,
that's my channel.
yeah, and thank you for doing these lectures. I was looking forward to hearing these, so I'm really glad I got to it. So thank you. It's been good
Oh,
to
thank
see
you. Thank you. So more excitement, but this time starting next month, I guess, starting this Thursday. So there's no rest for the weary. Thank you so much.
Haribol.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sakyarati and Sham, for hosting these for me.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Hare Krishna.
Bhakti Abhay Ashram Maharaj ki jai.
Hare Krishna.
Jai. Jai.